Bible class on the continuation of the series of lessons from the book of Matthew. Brother Ivan will be heading this evening's class. We'll begin by singing hymn number 797. Hymn 797. We will sing the first, second, and fourth stanza. 797. Lord, we come before thee now, at thy feet we humbly bow. Oh, do not answer this day, shall we sing thee, Lord, in vain? Shall we sing thee, Lord, in vain? Lord, on thee our souls depend, in compassion now descend. Fill our hearts with thy rich grace, tune our lips to sing thy praise, tune our lips to sing thy praise. Grant that all may seek and find thee, a God supremely kind. Heal the sick, the captive free. Let us all rejoice in thee. Let us all rejoice in thee. Next, we sing hymn number 144. Hymn 144. We'll sing all three stanzas. Oh, worship the King of glorious above, and gratefully sing His wonderful love. Our shield and defender, the Ancient of Days, pavilion in splendor and girded with praise. Thy bountiful care, what thou can recite? It breathes in the air, it shines in the light, it streams from the hills, it descends to the plain, and sweetly distills in the dew and the rain. Frail children of dust and feeble as frail, in thee do we trust, nor find thee to fail. Thy mercies how tender, how firm to the end. Our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and friend. Next, we sing hymn number 863. Hymn 863. When all my labors and trials are o'er, and I am safe on that beautiful shore, just to be near the dear Lord I adore, will truly angels be glory for me. Oh, there will be glory for me. 845. Hymn 845. Gentle shepherd, come and lead us, for we need you to help us find our way. Gentle shepherd, come and feed us, for we need your strength from day to day. There's no other we can turn to, who can help us face another day. Gentle shepherd, come and lead us, for we need you to help us find our way. Let's go to our Lord in prayer. Let us pray. Almighty Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, for you are the one and only, truly almighty, all-powerful, all-loving God, that you love us so much that you gave your only begotten Son to die on the cross, so that we can have the hope of salvation, so that we can have the crown of life, if we were to be obedient to you, to obey the gospel message of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We thank you, dear Father, for giving us this opportunity. Thank you for your love for each and every one of us. Thank you for your providence and your care, and your continued guidance through your word. Pray, dear Father, that we will be able to, at this hour of Bible study, to be able to open our ears and open our hearts to be able to accept the words that are being taught to us from Scripture. We pray, dear Father, that we will be able to take it to heart, that we will be able to meditate and apply it in our lives, so that we can be shining lights to the world and salt of the earth. Pray, dear Father, for Brother Ivan, who is teaching us tonight, that you grant him the wisdom and understanding to be able to expound from your word in spirit and in truth. Pray, dear Father, for those who are still on their way here, that you give them safe journey mercies, that they may be able to join us in this hour of Bible study. We thank you once again, Holy Spirit, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Wednesday Bible class, and we will be continuing on the series that we've been doing on Matthew. And so last week we went through the first part of Matthew 23, and today we will continue on and somewhat finish this section from Matthew 23 verse 13 to 36. And the kind of theme or subtitle that you see in a lot of Bibles is Woe to the Scribes and Pharisees. And I think the learning that we can get out from these few verses is very similar to last week, and it's also pretty much a continuation from last week. So I'll do a short recap of some of the important points from last week, and we can move on from there. So first thing, we look at this idea of Jesus, in the New Testament or in the Gospels, where he's always under constant opposition. His message was never readily accepted by everyone, and a lot of times you read of these leaders who have hardened hearts, and that is kind of that reason that Jesus puts forth why they do not accept a lot of what he's saying to them. And we went through this verse, and I'll read it again because I think it's quite important. A lot of today's lesson will also follow on from this. So in Matthew 13, verse 13 and 15, I read, "Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, you will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of these people has become dull. With their eyes they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them. And this kind of is that summary Jesus puts forth. These people, because of their heart becoming dull, they hear physically, they see physically, but they do not understand and they do not perceive. Right? So it's kind of like that idea of an inanimate object. It might be sitting there, it receives inputs from the environment, but nothing really happens. And there's this diagram we put out, and I thought Quinton kind of did good addition to the diagram. We talked about this idea of the heart and how it kind of stands for man's entire mental, moral, rational and emotional being. And so it's not really the heart where we think of it of just the emotional part of the human, right? And the mind being the rational part. So this heart kind of is what I think the heart and the mind combined together. So the rational, emotional element together with the moral element. And so we look at Matthew 13, verse 13 to 15 we read earlier. You have this kind of structure. I think Quinton inverted it, and I think it's better that way. Where there's this message that comes to the people, and this context specifically the Jewish leaders. They have these eyes and these ears. Their eyes obviously see the miracles that Jesus performs. They see the things that Jesus is doing. They have ears, and obviously they can understand Jesus. Right? These Jewish leaders are educated people in that context. They are not people who do not understand the language and so couldn't comprehend what Jesus was trying to tell them. So even though they had eyes and ears to receive these inputs from the world around them, their heart was switched off, right? So these rational, emotional, moral part of their being was switched off. And so at the end of the day, hopefully as hands, I think this is what my dad likes to say last time, the head, the heart, and the hands. So basically the hands just represents the doing part. So the doing part is not there because even though the message gets into the ears and they see with their eyes, it reaches the heart and it stops there and nothing really happens. And in fact, in a lot of the cases we read of in the New Testament, not only did the Jewish leaders do nothing that essentially Jesus was telling them to do, a lot of the times they wanted to prosecute Jesus, right? And also essentially physically plot to destroy him. So we had this conclusion of Matthew 23, 11 to 12 last week, where somehow there's this kind of inversion going on compared to the world, right? But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. And so a lot of the verses we went through last week kind of covers these few themes that we looked at. And if we look down the kind of right side of this little table we have, or chart, that's pretty much what the Jewish leaders were doing, right? They talk a lot, they don't do, they come up with a lot of additional rules on top of what was given to them compared to God's rules. They have these outward shows of holiness, right? Whether it's the phylacteries that we talked about last week, where they have these boxes on their heads containing verses, and they want to make it bigger than the rest to show that I'm more holy, more devoted. They have these tassels. We look at them later again, where you have these garments, and the end of the garments have these knots and threads, and you want them to be longer than the rest. As an outward show of holiness, but inwardly, they do not have a contrite heart. In fact, their hearts are hardened, as Jesus has said. They want to be called rabbi, right? And we look at this word rabbi, it's basically the great one, instead of being a servant of God. And you can kind of summarize it with pride, right? They have their pride kind of encompassing them, that they no longer have the humility or open heart to accept what was being taught to them. So from that we move on to today's verses. And today when we go through the woes, I want us to think about these few kind of themes, just talkers, having additional rules, outward shows of holiness, wanting to have all these titles and pride, because these woes pretty much go through the same few themes and points. Once again, Jesus kind of reinforces the points and goes through all these woes to kind of, Jesus doesn't hold back. It just isn't a very nice description of the scribes and the Pharisees. So, we start with first verse, right? Matthew 23, verse 13 today. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people, for you do not enter in yourself, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So there's this idea of additional rules that they come up with. In a sense, I look at this, and somehow these scribes and Pharisees, they forgot who they really are, right? Are they supposed to be essentially the repeaters of the word given to them, or are they supposed to be repeaters plus an addition, right? To change what was given to them and add stuff to what was given to them, right? Is it their pride that they do so? Okay, but essentially that was what they were doing, right? By coming up with a lot of the additional rules, additional actions, additional tasks for the rest of the people to follow. And in doing so, they prevent some from entering the kingdom of heaven. So when the rules have no bearing and it's not from God, essentially it serves to lead people astray, right? If people are so focused on how my phylactery on my head is bigger than my other brother's phylactery, then I think you've lost the point, right? Kind of seeing whose box is bigger than the other, you've lost the big picture. And sometimes I ask, what could be an explanation why they want to make a lot of additional rules? And I would say, other than, pride being superior to the others in that context, one could be, I'll argue, the person who controls the knowledge controls the people, right? So it also gives them power. All these rules give them power. These scribes and Pharisees are people who are educated, right, knowledgeable, right, and people who cannot read in contrast versus the scribes and Pharisees who can. There's this relative sort of power. And then if you look back at a lot of the you might say communist or authoritarian regimes around the world, a lot of times the books are burned, right? In the Cultural Revolution, for example, books are burned, right? Why? Because it gives people power, right? People know things and they have knowledge and they know the truth, then they're not so readily accepting of everything thrown at them, right? Same thing as the internet when it's first launched, right? I'm not trying to say that the internet is everything on the internet is great, right? Obviously not. But when the internet was launched, it was opposed by the authorities. Why? Because information gives people knowledge, freedom, right, power. Right? It's not good for control. Essentially, the people no longer can be sheep, right? To be, fooled, right? Because they know the truth themselves. So, in this sense, that's the first kind of woe put forth, and it's really that idea of coming up with these additional rules. And in doing so, they are not leading people towards God, right? Essentially, they're preventing people from entering the kingdom. So, direct opposite. So, we move on to the next point. I know some Bibles have Matthew 23, verse 14. I just chose to skip it because they do say that some manuscripts, older manuscripts, do not have verse 14. But if you read Matthew 23, verse 14, it really goes through the same theme, and it's not misaligned with any other verses. But I'll just continue on from verse 15. All right, Matthew 23, verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much as the the son of hell as yourselves. So once again, you have this idea of additional rules, and instead of leading people towards God, it's almost leading people away from God, right? So it's almost like the blind leading the blind. Both of them are not going anywhere. So these converts are converted using the wrong rules, and almost like the Pharisees are leading people more and more right off the cliff to hell, right? This is a very strong word here. And really you have that kind of idea, some of the commentators talk about this idea of how a lot of times you train your mentee and your mentee becomes twice as much as the person you are. So for example, in this case, if you're a Pharisee, you have a mentee and you train him in all these rules, right? Big box, long tassels, and he becomes even better than you. The next round he's teaching, he say, we have maybe it's 10 cm box, the next time it's 20 cm, the next time it's 40 cm, I don't know why we come with a huge box, right? And you have this idea of the pass the message game, right? You remember this game where you have this long line of people and you're passing the message across. So the first one, let's say it's already a corrupted message. By the time you reach the end, it'll be extremely corrupt, right? It'll be a mix of messages. It doesn't resemble anything like the first message. So I think it's something like that idea. Some people say it could be that kind of one-upmanship kind of spirit where it's a competition, right? So you lost sight of the big picture. Really, it becomes a one-upmanship where if you do these things to show that you're holy, then I will do more than you to show everyone else that I'm holier, right? Holier than you. So it's very focused on the external, right, rather than internal. So the second woe, very similar to the first. And then they come up with even more rules, right? Verse 16 we read once again of even more rules. So 16 to 22 reads, "Woe to you, blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, there is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, there is nothing, but whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sacrifices the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it." So I thought, this set of verses is kind of complicated. So I was trying to figure out, what does this kind of tell us? And I think we try to put it simply, once again the Pharisees are adding additional rules, right? Missing the big picture. They've come up with some set of rules where if you are swearing by the gold of the temple, it's more legitimate, okay, than swearing by the temple itself. And so they create these kinds of distinctions in the practices. And there's a few things to take note here. Of course, in verse 19 to 22, Jesus calls them, you blind men, right? You are missing the point altogether. And if you want to look at it in Numbers, oaths made towards the Lord should be kept, right? It's not about whether it's swearing by the gold or swearing by the temple. It's not like, we're talking about the finance world here, where if your collateral is more valuable, you can loan more money, right? It's like if you have more assets, you can go to the bank and have a bigger loan, right? It's not about that, all right? Jesus is telling them that you guys are missing the point. There shouldn't be a distinction here that any oath, right, vow made towards God, right, should be kept, right? It's not about how much gold is backing, your vow, right? So Numbers 30 verse 2, it reads, "If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word, he shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." And so it's not about having your oath and adding all these additional rules. My oath is better because it's backed by gold. It's almost like my currency is better because it's backed by gold. And the currency isn't backed by gold, then it's not valuable, right? It's not that idea, okay? Essentially, they've got it all wrong. And on top of that, if you read in Matthew 5, verse 33 to 37, it talks about the idea of what is more important is that we should have integrity, right? Letting our yes be a yes and a no being a no, right? There's no need to invoke God's name in an oath. So I read Matthew verse 5, 33 to 37, and we read of this concept. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for is the throne of God, or by earth, for is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond this is of evil, right? So it's of that idea where you should just have integrity rather than trying to invoke all these vows, right? Swearing by something. So once again, these scribes and Pharisees have these additional rules. They add on it, and they miss the bigger picture, right? By adding all these additional rules. So what else? So what else other than additional rules are they accused of, right, by Jesus? And if we read further down in Matthew 23, verse 23, 24, this is a similar point, but somewhat different, where these scribes and Pharisees were very focused on small picture, right, where they miss the big picture. So in verse 23, 24, it says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, having neglected the weightier provisions of law, justice and mercy and faithfulness, but these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel, right? So you have this kind of comparison when Jesus talks about how these scribes and Pharisees are so focused on this tithing. They start to tithe all these small little things, but then they forget the important things, right? Here it talks about the weightier provisions of law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And you have this example of the gnat and the camel. Okay, we'll go through that later. Just one point here. In this context, it's not wrong to tithe. Okay, in Deuteronomy 14, verse 22, it reads, "You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year." And so, what is more, pertinent, or what Jesus is pointing to here is they are focusing on the small details, but forgot what is truly important. And if you look at the wording in Matthew 23, verse 23, right there, it says, "These are the things you should have done without neglecting the others," right? So Jesus is not trying to say that, all these practices, this tithing you're doing is wrong, right? But saying that in focusing on these little details, you guys have missed the point, right? So all these small details have led you to forget a lot of the more important things. And so Jesus aptly summarizes it, right? This big picture, small picture. He says that you guys, right, blind guides who strain out the net and swallow the camel, right? So somehow you have this strainer and you strain out all these small things, right, like a net, right? I would assume a net is like a mosquito in size, or it is a mosquito. So basically like the size of a mosquito. And you're trying to filter this mosquito out, and somehow you miss the camel, right, which is probably 1,000 times bigger, maybe 10,000 times bigger than a mosquito. So it's that idea of focusing so much on the small picture that really you have missed the big picture. So what else, right? So what else other than additional rules, missing big picture, focusing on the small picture? In verse 25 and 26, we read of this idea of the outward holiness versus the inwardly dirty nature, right? So this pretty much is a continuation from last week, right? We talked about the phylacteries, right, up there, the big box on the head, right, containing verses, and also on the arm, right, and the tassels at the bottom, right, so it's a bit small picture, but basically it's a garment. At the end of the garment there's this string that comes up, right, and a knot. And so what they were trying to do, right, to project this image of outward holiness is that if I have a bigger box, everyone can think I'm better than someone else, right, more holy than others. If I can have a longer tassel than others, then I can prove that I am, more holy than others. So it's really that idea of comparing and wanting praise from men rather than focusing on the inner things, right, or the heart. So here, that's what Jesus is trying to, bring to light. Matthew 23, verse 25, 26 read, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also." And so it's that idea of outward actions, right? A lot of outward actions, a lot of showboating, a lot of wanting praise from men, but inside, that's where the problem lies, right? So Matthew 23, verse 5, all they do their deeds to be noticed by men, right? So right there, the intention is wrong. For they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. So like a cup, super clean on the outside, but the inside is dirty. And you look at a cup is not much use if the inside is dirty and the outside is clean, right? Because you use the inside to drink. So I think somewhat, the analogy is going that way. In this sense, you look at their heart, right? Emotional, rational, moral being is being far from God. And this was the first passage we read today, Matthew 13, verse 13 to 15, right? They might be having eyes fully functional to see, right? They might have ears that can hear, but they do not understand and they do not perceive. And they definitely do not do the things that God wants them to do. So, what else? The next point is very similar to this point. So, also on outward holiness and inwardly dirty. So, Matthew 23, verse 27 to 28, the next few verses reads, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs. On the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and uncleanness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." So once again, similar concept to before. Inwardly dirty, outwardly looks great. So I've thought about this concept, and I thought about the idea of the cup. It's this idea of a deodorant. So when I was in national service last time, you go out in the field and you do your training. Your uniform is extremely smelly by the end of the day. And I know some of my friends, they like to have this thing called Febreze, right? It's some kind of deodorant. And they will spray their uniform after being out of the field for the whole day. And you think you'll make it clean. But to me, I thought, actually, you're not really cleaning your clothes by spraying deodorant on your dirty clothes. Doesn't really make sense. All you're doing is that you're masking the problem, but that doesn't make your clothes any cleaner than before. Right? So it's kind of that idea. On the outside it's all clean, but inwardly, really, that's where the problem lies. And you're not really solving the problem, you're just masking it. So this idea of the scribes and Pharisees, where they're like whitewashed tombs on the outside, really beautiful, but inside they're full of dead men's bones, kind of puts forth that kind of concept. Outwardly appearing righteous, right? We talk about phylacteries, tassels. They do all these things to be noticed by men. Outwardly appearing righteous, but inwardly full of hypocrisy and lawlessness, right? And you can see from the heart translate to the action, right? Because of their heart inwardly, their actions obviously was not what Jesus was trying to tell them to do. And so this is the idea of the kind of comparison between the inward and outward nature of the Pharisees. So what else? We move on. So obviously there's nothing good here. Jesus doesn't praise them anyway, all these woes. We move on to the next one. Okay, Matthew 23 verse 29 to 32. And really kind of talks about this idea of pride, blinding these scribes and Pharisees to their own problems. Matthew 23 verse 29 to 32 reads, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers." And so, very interestingly, the scribes and Pharisees, they raise this point that, if we were in the same situation as our forefathers, right, the Israelites, we would not have rebelled against the message, the prophets brought, and persecute them. But we know this is completely false, right? So I just read an example here, right? Matthew 12 verse 13 to 14, right? This was the healing of the man with the withered hand, right? So one of the miracles. So in Matthew chapter 12 verse 13 and 14 it reads, "Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him." So, and this is what Jesus is telling them. When I was healing this man, instead of trying to understand the message I'm trying to bring across, you conspired against me. So, if we read Matthew 7, 3 to 5, it kind of also reminds us of that concept where you have this plank in your eye, right? That you forget, but you have this plank in your eye, and all you care about is the dust in your brother's eye. So it's the idea where pride, and on top of pride, it could be the heart, right, that is switched off, has already blinded them to their own problems. That they focus so much about other people's problems, but they fail to even look at themselves individually. So Matthew 7 verse 3 to 5, "Why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." So this is a case where pride, switch off hearts, or combination of both, caused these scribes and Pharisees to no longer see their own problem, but instead be very focused on the problems of others. So once again, missing the big picture and not understanding what Jesus is telling them. So if you look at verse 32 right here, fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. Jesus is pretty much telling them that you are no different from your forefathers. You're pretty much the same, where when the prophets come, you prosecute the prophets and do not listen to the message that we're trying to tell you. So once again here, not only was Jesus was essentially God in front of them, but they still couldn't see the message. Even Jesus was directly interacting with them. So it's that idea. They are no different from their forefathers, and they also will eventually, of course, not only prosecute Jesus, right, but lead him to his death. Alright, so Jesus ends with kind of these few verses and says, "You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues. and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. And so, this is a very, negative description of them, right, from Jesus. And Jesus compares them to this idea of serpents and vipers, right? So these crafty and evil people, really, they say one thing, but they do another. Their hearts are shut off, and they act and appear all holy, but really their actions prove otherwise. So a lot of disciples we know, right? They were sent. I think all were persecuted. Some died. If you look at Jesus, pretty much persecuted all the way to death. And so this is no surprise. Jesus already warns the disciple of this fact. In Matthew 10, verse 16 to 18, he says, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. But beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. And you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles." And so Jesus already knew all this, right? And know that the disciples will face a lot of the persecution that he similarly faced. And of course, faced, I would say, argue to a much worse degree. So this kind of comparison of Abel to Zechariah, I wouldn't want to go too deep into this, but basically you have the first righteous man, right? Abel, right? Genesis 4, all the way to Zechariah in Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles. And in verse 36, Jesus is saying that all these things that happened in the past will also happen again. And it's no surprise. So these scribes and Pharisees, no different from their forefathers, once again, they also reject God's message. Right? They were not people who accepted God's message. So, like last week, I think one of the good ways to kind of draw applications from this set of verses is from Luke, right? 18 verse 14. When we look at this comparison between the Pharisee and the tax collector, and really it plays on that idea of where is your heart, right, in accepting the message. So in Luke verse 18, 10 to 14 reads, "Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself: God, I thank you that I am, right, not like the other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I pay tithes, all that I get. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and but he who humbles himself will be exalted." And really, I think this is, kind of the application that I can draw from these few verses, where you have these two comparisons. You have this Pharisee, and we read a lot about it, right, in the whole of Matthew 23, where you're always thinking about, I'm not like others. I do all these things. I'm so holy. I have all these physical shows of holiness. Matthew 16 verse 16, I have a gloomy face. I pay tithes. But I would say here, right, that, and this is really Jesus' point, that these people, in doing all these things, think themselves better than all the other people in that case, rank, more powerful. And because of that, a lot of the pride has already crept in and hardened their hearts. And so, that's the idea I'm trying to bring forth today. When we look at the Pharisee versus the tax collector, who recognizes essentially his standing with God, had that fear of God, saying that God, be merciful to me, right? So can we have that kind of same attitude, same heart, to recognize that essentially that degree of separation, right? The holiness of God, the perfect holiness of God, and our sinful self, rather than the Pharisee who thinks that, oh, because I do all these things, then maybe I'm better than everyone else, right? But we know, right, Romans 3:23, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and none of us, whatever we do, obviously the big box won't help us, be holier than anyone else. All right, and similarly, in their case, in the scribes and Pharisees, that big phylactery box does not make them holier than anyone else. So the conclusion today is really the same conclusion as last week. I thought about this and I thought, the conclusion is the same. Is our heart switched on, or is it hardened? Right? So when we hear the message, with our eyes and ears, we receive all these inputs from the world around us. Do we have hearts that are soft enough, right? That is switched on, right? That it processes what God is trying to tell us, and then it translates to action, right? It changes us, makes us do certain things. Or do we see and hear, and then we just turn the switch off, and pretty much there's no difference than not listening to the message at all? Or even worse, we hear the message and we go against it, right? So that is kind of the conclusion today, right? Are we like the scribes and Pharisees, or are we like the tax collector, right? And of course, they cover a whole spectrum of things, right? The talker, having all these additional rules, having these shows of our holiness, wanting to be called, these names, and having a lot of pride. So can we shift more to the left side, right? The opposite of that, right? And have a soft heart to accept, the message that God tells us or teaches us through the word that is given us. And so that is where I'll leave it for today, where we end off Matthew 23, and I end off in verse 36. A small section left, but I'll end off here. Any questions or comments on the lesson? Yep.
I was thinking, when Jesus encounters the Pharisees and the scribes, he doesn't normally, in his earlier ministry, he didn't normally use such strong language like he uses here. But this is the last week of his life.
Yeah.
And so, he hasn't got a lot of time, so he's really turning up the volume and the aggression and getting the last lessons that he wants in before his time is up. So you can really see that in this chapter.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point where, Jesus was right at the end. And like you said, in the beginning, even for the miracles that he performed, he always says, do not tell anyone about what was done, right? But now towards the end, pretty much because he probably knows the consequence, that all these things, like poking the hornet's nest, will eventually lead to them really performing the action, right, that they wanted to do, right, and come and lead to the persecution and death.
And
so that's a good point. Yeah.
Pushing over tables in the temple.
Yeah. So it scales up, and then the consequence comes. Yeah, it's a good point. Any more points? Okay, if there's no points, we close in a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful for this day that we can come together to learn another portion of your word. And we are grateful that we have these words written down for us that we can learn from. And we pray that as we read these words, that we have hearts soft and switched on, that we can digest the words. And we pray that these words lead us to change in our lives, and that we do not shut off our hearts from the message that you bring to us through your word. We also pray for those who are unwell, those who are unable to be here today, that you continue to be with them, that your grace and providence continue to be with all those who are unwell, not here. And we pray that as we go back to our homes, that you give us a safe trip, journey back. And all this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Teacher